breaths in and out. And if you're seated, you can just make sure that your feet are sort of on the floor. And I wonder if someone could close the door back there. Thanks. So let's breathe in and out. In and out. In and out. And maybe another one for good measure. In and out. Do not fear, I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. Do not fear, I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. Let's try it together. Do not fear, I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. Do not fear, I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. Add a harmony if you hear it. Do not fear, I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. Do not fear, I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. Amen.
I am so happy to introduce my good friend Emily Scott. Emily is a church planter, a Lutheran pastor in the ELCA. Emily believes that Christian practice holds out rich possibilities that call us to reach out across boundaries in love, learn through discomfort, and to build relationships that bring God's realm close. Emily currently serves as the founding pastor of Dreams and Visions, an imaginative spiritual community of restoration rooted in the LGBTQ plus community of which she is a part. From 2008 to 2017, Emily served as the founding pastor of St.Lydia's Dinner Church in Brooklyn, where worship is a full meal shared around a dinner table. St.Lydia's is now a national model for new church starts and congregations seeking to explore the practice of dinner church. Her work at St.Lydia's has been covered by The Atlantic and The Wall Street Journal. Her book, For All Who Hunger, Searching for Communion in a Shattered World, will be released in this spring, 2020, from Penguin Random House. It's available for pre-order now.
And I'm very glad to introduce my friend, Wendy Barrie, who is the author of Faith at Home, a handbook for cautiously Christian parents, published in 2016 by Morehouse, an imprint of Church Publishing, and is at work on a new book about intergenerational faith formation, The Church Post-Sunday School, which will be published by Morehouse in spring 2021. Wendy is responsible for children and family faith formation and education at Trinity Church Wall Street in Lower Manhattan, and has served a total of 7 Episcopal congregations on both coasts over 30 years of lay ministry, which is not coincidental to having grown up in an Episcopal church that took her gifts as a child and a teenager seriously enough to use them every week.
From the time I was 2.5 until I was 18, my church was St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Laguna Beach, California. Naturally, I thought all churches were like my church. I remember the smell of incense and the sound of Sanctus bells, and the sight of people coming down the aisle in shorts, t-shirts, and flip-flops. Until I was in my late teens, I thought every church had gay and lesbian families. When I was 10, I was paid 50 cents an hour to help Miss Gigi with the babies and toddlers in the church nursery. 50 cents an hour. I knew it was my job to help them feel God's love, that we did that by reading to them and playing with them, giving a bottle to a baby and changing the occasional diaper. When I was 11, I was confirmed, and I was awestruck that the adults who taught us encouraged us to wrestle with ideas like transubstantiation and consubstantiation. I remember my first taste of the bread and wine made holy. The new prayer book wasn't out yet, but we had the green book, and my imagination was caught by the will of God creating the vast expanse of interstellar space, planets, the galaxies, suns, and planets in their courses, and this fragile Earth, our island home. At 14, I started teaching Sunday school, and it was before I'd ever heard of godly play. But Brad Corellius, who had been our seminarian and then our curate, baptized my baby doll, Elizabeth Ann, for my class of 4- and 5-year-olds because I was teaching a lesson on baptism, and I asked him to. I sang in the choir. On any given Sunday, we might sing Mozart and music from Godspell and Wade in the Water. At that point, I was also the youngest member of my church's Christian Education Committee, led by my beloved Mrs. Mudge, who was not only our director of religious education, but she was my 4th, 5th, and 6th grade social studies teacher at Aliso Elementary School, and the person who directed me in plays and gave me the job of editor of the school newspaper and let me sing in the chorus, even though my father told me I couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. And she recommended me as an assistant to the school principal so that I could answer the phone at lunchtime. Aliso School, student speaking, may I help you? The Christian Education Committee met on Sundays after church so that I could be at the meetings. During the summer after my freshman year in high school, my parents separated, and for a period of several months, my mother stopped going to church in her pain. I, however, got on the bus and went by myself because I was pretty sure they couldn't have church without me. God is a mystery, but how children and youth grow into an adult faith is not. We now have 40 years of longitudinal research from across the country, actually across the world, and across denominations. In October 2014, I heard sociologist Christian Smith deliver the Ensign Lecture at Yale University's Divinity School, and what he had to say in about 45 minutes struck me hard and made me realize I needed to write the book that I wrote in 2016, Faith at Home, a handbook for cautiously Christian parents. He was reporting the conclusions drawn from the 4th wave of data of the National Study of Youth and Religion, a longitudinal study of more than 3,000 youth, which began in 2001. He said unequivocally that the single greatest influence on the spiritual and religious lives of American teenagers is their parents. Not the clergy, not youth ministers, that home is the place where faith is passed on, not church, not camp, not mission trips, and that the means of transmission is ordinary life practices, not preaching, not programs, not even rites of passage. Nothing else, Smith said, comes remotely close to matching the influence of parents on the religious and faith and practices of youth. The statistics are startling. 82% of children whose parents were active in their congregations, who practiced their faith, and who talk about matters of faith at home were religiously active as young adults. Only 1% of older teens, whose parents placed little emphasis on religion, were religiously active as young adults. So this poses an interesting dilemma for us, the paid professionals. And of course, we have powerful cultural scripts that ask parents to give their children over to experts. Many religious parents, according to Smith, operate on the model that someone else is responsible for forming their children religiously. It's possible that we ourselves think that. However, I have come to think of my job differently. Our job is to encourage parents to accept and embrace their role as their children's primary pastors. And our job is also to give them the religious vocabulary they need to articulate their faith. So that's what prompted me to write my first book. What inspired me, however, was the year I spent walking alongside a family whose youngest child was dying. Beloved Frances was diagnosed just after her first birthday with an always fatal genetic disorder. Her parents were longtime members, though not so frequent attenders, of the church where I worked, and they were also neighbors of mine whose older children attended the same elementary school as my son. Just a month after her diagnosis, Frances's parents reached out to me. I was immediately struck by the clarity of their request. Please help us guide our family in accepting and understanding the death of a loved one through the traditions of our faith. When I went over the first time, I took a candle, 2 carefully chosen picture books about heaven, and some homemade cookies. This visit set the pattern for countless others over the next year. Tea and conversation about ordinary and profound things, folding laundry, emptying the dishwasher, holding Frances, being present. What did they need? They needed prayers, of course. They also needed to know how to talk about prayer, so that from the beginning, Frances's older siblings, Madeline and Charles, would understand that praying harder or more earnestly would not save their sister's life. Prayer is about intention, not intervention. But we don't say that often enough or clearly enough to children or adults. My friends needed prayers, and they needed actual prayers. They wanted to find authentic ways to introduce the sacred into the everyday moments of family life, noticing and naming where God is present and when. I gave them mealtime graces and bedtime prayers, and if we had become remiss in that habit ourselves, that year my son Peter, who was 9 at the time, made sure we didn't forget. The ritual of bidding God's presence, expressing gratitude, asking for peace, was necessary for us too. And it became increasingly harder for them to come to church. So I started looking for ways to strengthen the connection between church and home. I wrote a prayer for them to celebrate their children's baptismal anniversaries. I delivered supplies for Advent wreath making. I brought them Lent in a bag. And mostly, I just kept showing up. Once, when the tea kettle was coming to a boil, Frances's mother asked me whether I thought Frances's short life would have meaning. I answered immediately and affirmatively and with considerable passion. But I continued to think about her question and reflect on it. I came to hear in it the overarching question of how we make meaning in and of our lives. Frances came to be loved and to love, and she is still present in the love her family shares with one another. Isn't that how God is present to us? And Jesus is present to us right now? We long for connection, for belonging and purpose, for ourselves and for our children. We find them in the traditions of our faith, and we practice them at home so we can take them out into the world, helping to bring about the kingdom of heaven, the realm of God. The traditions of our faith and family life are stronger and deeper in both places when they are in conversation with each other. As I read more research, I discovered that participation in Sunday school and youth group are not indicators of those kids and teens who become faithful adults. What matters most, according to research from the Fuller Youth Institute and others, is participation and worship and connection to other adults in the faith community. The good news is we already have worship and other adults in our faith community. And what this means in practical terms is that if we're going to effectively support parents, actively engage all ages in worship, and connect them in meaningful ways to other members of our faith community, we might need to change some things on Sundays. Change is hard. Change in the church is even harder. After 30 years, this is a lesson I know well. I will tell you that steam shoots out of my ears whenever I hear someone say that children are the future of the church. This is a lie. The children are the church right now, and without them, we are incomplete. Church is one of the few places where we intentionally, in contemporary society, bring all ages together. So we have that going for us. If your Sunday school takes place at the same time as your worship service, you will notice an inherent conflict. There may even be parents in your congregation who welcome the opportunity to worship without their children. So I suggest we frame this as an opportunity. When children and teens are separated from the rest of the congregation during worship, they don't have the opportunity to develop a love of liturgy or practice the skills of corporate prayer, congregational singing, or even sitting quietly. They don't have the opportunity to experience the transcendence that so many of us seek and often find in worship. The encounter with beauty, mystery, and the presence of God that's the hallmark of our worship. I think for so many Episcopalians, liturgy is formation. I have the benefit of being in a congregation with a family Eucharist at 9:15 on Sunday mornings. This is at St. Paul's Chapel in Lower Manhattan. This service began 5.5 years ago when it was clear that Sunday school participation was growing and these families were not attending worship. So with a year of planning, the clergy, the staff, and members of the congregation formed a liturgy that is 45 minutes long. And now, 5.5 years later, we have over 200 people attending weekly. The service is 45 minutes long. It is not church light. We strive for beauty and joy. We have the flexibility of chairs in a horseshoe, and we put a carpet down in the middle. The architecture always wins. So if you have flexible space, it's a gift. Sometimes the children sit on the carpet during the sermon. They're invited by the priest. The homily is supposed to be 8 minutes tops. Usually it is. It is not directed all the time at the children, but it includes them. The music is strongly led, usually by a choir of teens or children. Sometimes adults, I think they get once a month. We choose beautiful, singable hymns with sound theology from a wide variety of sources, and we repeat them over the course of a season so that people will remember them and sing them heartily. We read one lesson plus the gospel, and we look for ways to encourage the participation of non-readers. During the prayers of the people, a sung response or even a spoken response that is the same response each time is really helpful. During the Eucharistic prayer, anyone who's drawn to the table may come and stand around it. My colleague Winnie Varghese breaks the priest's hosts into triangles and hands them out to the children to lift high in the air when she says, "These are the gifts of God, for the people of God." And every time I find myself getting teary-eyed at that moment. We have jobs that we assign at the very last minute so anyone can participate. It's a heavy Ethiopian cross with beautiful ribbons, very much St. Gregory's. So a young child cannot carry them by themselves, but several children can carry it, or a child or an adult. And we have deep, light baskets for the offering so that children who can walk can carry it forward. We have children invited to read, to greet, to help people find what they need. There are coffee and donuts available all the time. Any point in the service, you can get what you need. So St. Paul's is the oldest building in continuous use in Manhattan. It is 254 years old, I believe, this year. It's where George Washington worshiped in his inauguration day, and where recovery workers were given respite 24 hours a day in the months after 9/11. At 9:15 on Sunday mornings for 45 minutes, joyful chaos bubbles over. Or you could take your child to dinner church, where you might in fact meet the person you'll marry, which is what happened to me at St.Lydia's dinner church in Brooklyn.
Thank you. Wendy tells such beautiful stories about a liturgy that sees and lifts up the gifts of children. And I think that so often children are placed at the margins of our church and at our worship. Sometimes they're actually located in rooms that are in the basement or off to one side, kind of away from the center. But look what happens when we place children at the center. They become theologians, and Jesus shows up. As a church planter, I've been interested in learning what happens when we place at the center of our worship all of those who have been placed on the outside. And that might be children, it might be elders, it might be those who have different abilities, it could be those who make their homes on the street. But I think we find that once we shift folks from the outside to the center, it sort of disrupts and changes our ways of approaching the liturgy and what we do each time we gather. So I have a few stories I want to share about what God does when we practice liturgy in this way and how that forms us as Christians. As a church planter, I have this marvelous opportunity to start from scratch and work with new congregants to root deeply into the stories and tradition of our faith and formulate liturgy for a specific culture and context and place. The gospel is for everyone, and it will look different wherever you plant that seed of the gospel. It will reflect the culture and the community, or at least I believe that it should. The first congregation that I convened, St.Lydia's in Brooklyn, where Wendy and I met each other and where she also met her husband, was planted in New York City among mostly young adults who were often feeling isolated and lonely in one of the world's busiest and most ambitious, most anonymous cities. And so we rekindled the early church practice of the Eucharist, which was gathering together around a table to share a common meal that we cooked together, and we called it dinner church. We placed a particular focus on welcome. Knowing that our vast city made so many people feel nameless, we made sure that everyone wrote out a name tag first thing when they walked in the door. The service was intimate and invited congregants to tell a piece of their own story in a story sharing after my very brief sermon. The whole service was focused around being recognized and known and designed around that need. Around meeting a Christ who is present among us at the table in the breaking of the bread. Wendy has been doing such beautiful writing about the need to introduce our congregants to a living God, not a sort of powerful, distant ruler in the sky like a divine parent or judge, but a God who is a mystery, who's incarnate, present in bread and the cup, and in the still small voice, in the uncertainty of our lives, in the moments that feel uncertain. And that's so much of what I think I was hoping and trying to do with St.Lydia's, to stop telling people about God all the time and instead introduce them to a mystery, to create a place of encounter where we meet God face to face in very simple and ordinary things like a shared meal or the stories we shared. And in fact, my hope was that all of Christian life, all of Christian formation could be buried and held inside of our liturgy, so that there wasn't a moment in time when someone who was there for the first time would come to me and say, well, that's really lovely, but what does it all mean? I wanted our symbols to be so felt and so transparent and so known that it was abundantly clear what was happening. That if we were talking about gathering around a table where there was a feast that God had given us, we were literally standing around a table and there was a feast in front of us. Our baptismal font was a big washing tub that was like made out of galvanized tin. And it was right on the floor where often the kids would come and splash and dip their fingers. We would sometimes give them branches during Easter so that they could fling water around to everyone. But the sense that all of our symbols spoke in a way that was so clear that no one could miss the meaning. That was really what we were trying to achieve, and so much of that was rooted in the work of Rick Fabian and Donald Schell at St. Gregory of Nyssa in San Francisco. So that's a little sort of taste of what worship looked like at St. Lydia's, but I think that once you open yourself up to this living God and start placing people who have often been on the margins in the center, you will find that God is very pesky and keeps upending all of your best laid plans, which can be very distressing for some of us, including me. And she might even upend your liturgy. I was recently reminded of a story that I had forgotten about. At St. Lydia's when I was there, and still, there is a congregant whose name is Eula. Eula, when our church began, was using a walker, and several years later was in a wheelchair. And she lived at a rehabilitation center and came to church via New York's accessorized system, which is not the world's most predictable or steady system. But it's a little van that you could schedule to come and pick you up if you were someone who had mobility issues, and it was part of our public transit system. And usually the accessoride was wildly late or wildly early, and we were very used to kind of pausing our dinner church service in the middle so that we could take out the ramp that we used to kind of make our 2 steps into our storefront wheelchair accessible, and to help Eula get in and out sometime during dinner church whenever she arrived. So that was part of our practice. One evening when the accessoride pulled up, it was kind of just as worship was beginning, and we were all kind of waiting for Eula to come down, and there was some confusion about what was happening. And I heard, just as worship was starting, that the hydraulic lift that was meant to lower her down from the van had broken, and she was stuck inside the van. And so all through the beginning of the liturgy, there was like this scurrying about, kind of trying to solve the problem, trying to figure it out, but it became clear that Eula wasn't going to make it to church that night. By this time, we had sung our gathering song and lit our candles, and we had processed to the tables where we had dinner and placed our candles in the trays of sand on each table. And I had begun to chant our Eucharistic prayer with the bread in front of me. My hands were held up, and I looked through the window of our storefront church to see that Eula's van was still there. And suddenly it struck me as just completely wrong. It was so wrong that we were practicing the Eucharist and sharing the bread inside our church, and Eula was outside sitting in a van separate from us. And the congregation was singing this sung response that was woven through the Eucharistic prayer. And after they stopped singing, I sang, and now we're going to go outside and bring the bread and go to the accessoride and have communion with Eula. Glory to God forever and ever. And we just kind of sang our way out onto the sidewalk and across the street, and all of us piled singing into the accessoride. And the driver was very surprised. When we were all crowded inside, I sang the words. And we broke the bread and we passed it around saying, "This is my body," to one another, and even the driver took some. And then Eula went home. She wasn't able to stay for the rest of the service, and we all went back inside. But I think what I find is that when we're formed around this living God who's always calling us to draw the table wider and to bring folks from the outside to the center, we start to find ourselves bending over backwards in ways that we wouldn't have expected, that disrupt our patterns and our routines. When we draw the table wide, we'll be drawn out of those habits, and we might even find ourselves a bit annoyed. And I actually think that this is what Bishop Curry is often talking about, the way of love, that the way of love is not the way of every day. It draws us to a different path, to a different way of being. I also think that way of love is different from the way of perfection. Those are 2 different ways. And the way of love often interrupts the perfection that I know I often seek in the liturgies that I plan. So when we talk about formation, I wonder if we're offering experiences that invite people to live in the way of love, or if we're hoping for them to get on the path to perfection. Liturgy in the Episcopal Church, I'm now a Lutheran pastor, but I grew up Episcopalian, and it has deeply formed who I am and my theology. Liturgy in the Episcopal Church is transcendent. It's beautiful. And also sometimes the most transcendent moments are when God gives us unexpected gifts, when we find that our liturgy is upended. Those are the beautiful moments. The desire to follow these unexpected gifts God places in our path has grown as I've entered into work at the second congregation that, congregants and I are planting together in Baltimore, which is where I now live. And the name of this congregation is Dreams and Visions. And we are not a dinner church because the context and community in Baltimore is completely different from the context and community in Brooklyn. And it's calling for a very different kind of expression of church. We call ourselves a creative community of restoration where we find the courage to be our full selves. I am queer, and our congregation is rooted in the LGBTQ community. And so we are seeking to make a place that can receive trans and non-binary folks especially, with a very particular form of welcome. The large majority of my congregants have been told that God is not for them because of their sexual or gender identity. And many of them have experienced spiritual trauma, and I have heard story after story that breaks my heart. So sharing the message that they are beloved is the most important thing that I do. And second, reading the Bible with them through a queer lens, showing them that though people like us have been read over or ignored in our biblical stories, we are there. Queerness is there, woven through the Bible, and you actually don't have to look far to find it. You just have to look with different eyes. I'm thinking of the ways that Wendy has talked about working to invite children to be part of the liturgy, just as everyone is. And they are so often overlooked as capable participants in the work of the people. But we also do the same with so many other folks, homeless folks, people with disabilities, people who maybe can't read well. And I know that my tendency often is to look for the sort of most capable people to volunteer because I'm in a hurry a lot of the time, and I need someone who's going to do it right, who's going to sort of just make it all happen. But I've been learning that right is not the same thing as beautiful. Recently, I asked a congregant who's formerly homeless and has a traumatic brain injury to share her story of belovedness. How did she come to see herself as loved by God? And she'll be sharing in February, but I know that that story is one that all of us deeply need to hear. And it may not be the most well-organized or, professional, but it's needed. We need to hear it. I think that we have to shift our expectations from, getting things done and getting boxes ticked to walking alongside people and making time for their stories. Wendy's story about Francis is one that brings me so much hope because I think that it takes something very intentional to continue to show up with someone who's in the midst of a crisis because we all have to-do lists that are a mile long, and often we frame our work around what has to happen at our computers. So one of the questions I've been asking recently is what is my real work? Where is the work of formation taking place? And I think it's not always at the computer. In fact, it rarely is. If we orient the work of the people around all of God's people, I think we'll find that our liturgy is changed and we are changed as well in ways that possibly are upsetting and that we didn't hope for, but are deeply vital and necessary for a vital church and for vital souls. So Wendy and I, we have a shared history, and we thought what we'd do today is ask each other a few questions and then open it for y'all to ask us questions, if that sounds okay.
That sounds great.
So, yes, questions.
So, when I came to St. Lydia's, I had no intention of another church community being added to my existing large job. And it was Peter, my son, who was 8 turning 9 the first time we went to St. Lydia's, who insisted that we go back. Of course, what was really interesting was that St. Lydia's was an entirely different context and experience of church for him. He didn't need another form of worship as much as he needed more people around his table. I'd been a single parent for a long time when we met you and when Donald Schell invited us to come to St. Lydia's. And immediately, Peter was invited to participate. And there weren't many kids at St. Lydia's in those days. It was before Waffle Church. But he immediately saw that he was needed. He was welcomed, he was needed, he was put to work. And I'm wondering how that intention began, because obviously it existed before Peter and I walked in the door.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, Peter. Poor Peter gets talked about all the time by church folk.
Which is why he's not in the room right now. He introduced Emily last night at her book reading. He felt really good about that. But yeah, no, he didn't want to be here any of the stories today.
Peter taught us a lot about who we were becoming as a community. I think he showed us who we could be. And he was gracious enough to do that with us. But I think part of welcoming Peter was part of something that I had hoped to kind of bake into the culture at St. Lydia's, which is the idea that your belonging is immediate and without question. So we tried very hard to create permeable boundaries around every leadership structure in the church. which meant that you could walk in that night and be asked to read, to be the deacon. Everyone was asked to help cook in the kitchen or to set out napkins or forks and set the table. And this idea was kind of rooted in some things that I learned as a community organizer, which is that people care about something more if they've had a hand in building it. And my favorite part of church was always the time beforehand when you were getting ready. And I'd been formed in the ecumenical chapel at Yale Divinity School, where we did a lot of creative worship, and I loved going in early in the morning and setting out the flowers and putting out, bowls of stones and just making the space look beautiful, and sometimes doing that with my fellow chapel ministers. And I thought that was the best part. And I was sort of annoyed that only certain people at the church got to do that part. And I thought it would be wonderful to open it to everyone. And so we started off with we had a flexible start time, like sort of a soft start. You could arrive between 5:30 and 6, which was great for the subways, because you can't always tell when the subways are going to arrive. So whenever you arrived, worship had begun because you were there and you were given a job and asked to be involved. And I think that practice spilled over, honestly, in a way we didn't expect to children, and kind of saying, well, everyone gets a job, so that means everybody. Yeah.
Well, and a huge part of that, too, is the music that you use. And I don't know whether you've continued to use paperless music at Dreams and Visions.
A little bit, yeah.
Because the gift of that was that the music is taught in the moment every time. So there's no assumption that everyone knows the song we're singing. So that was a real gift to me and to my ministry elsewhere. Can you say more about your practice of music in that context?
Yeah, I think so. We did almost exclusively paperless music, or music that was taught in the moment, so similar to what we did this morning as we began. And again, it was around creating this kind of boundaryless worship experience where you didn't need to have any prior information to participate. The goal was that anyone walking in off the street would have everything that they needed to take part in worship, and not only have everything that they needed, but have it in a way that felt kind of broken open in terms of hospitality, that it wasn't existing on a piece of paper in front of you, but it existed among the community. And so we taught music to each other, and we made dinner together. Everything was very formulated around what the community could do together as a group. So the paperless music was beautiful because every time it was taught, and the teaching was part of the practice. And we tried very hard to never say things like, oh, I think we all know this one now. And this is, again, we're going to talk in a minute about St. Gregory's, which we've referenced a few times, but so much learning from both of us came from St. Gregory of Nyssa. But really formulating liturgy around the experience of the newcomer. And so often we formulate liturgy around the experience of the people who come every week. But when you look at it through the eyes of the newcomer and say, we actually want to focus this whole experience around their presence, what changes and shifts to make that possible? And that meant that our entire congregation was in fact focused toward the newcomer, because our liturgy was focused toward the newcomer. So we created a congregation of people that was so rooted in the idea of welcoming someone who was new, as opposed to kind of keeping someone a bit on the outside because we created a clique. And I would say that was our first 4 years of work, was creating that culture of welcome and belonging.
That's been an interesting piece that we did not expect with the 9:15 Family Eucharist at St. Paul's Chapel. There had been the supposition among some clergy and staff and parishioners that people would graduate from that service and go to real church at 11:15. And that has not been the case. And we continue to receive people who are new to church altogether, because guess what? They're part of a generation whose parents didn't go to church, didn't take them to church. We are increasingly finding families coming to us who are walking away from the faith they grew up with. So this is their first experience of a more expansive, inclusive God and Christianity. And so while this service was designed to fully include children and youth, we find that it also fully includes people who have some discomfort with church, the cautiously Christian, for whom I wrote my book. That subtitle comes from the brilliant Lisa Kimball, who could just, could zero in on the people I was trying to reach. But that congregation has continued to be a place where people who aren't aren't maybe ever going to want that formal liturgy. It's still very recognizably an Episcopal liturgy. It's still very beautiful, but it's not Trinity Church at 11:15. and I'm grateful for the different ways that we put practice at the front of what we do, because the practices lead us to a greater sense of both belonging and belief.
Yeah. It's interesting, the idea of the graduation, because I think there's assumptions that are buried in that, and one of them is that the norm is adults and the norm is formality.
Yes.
Like that's kind of where we're trying to go, and that's a pretty deep assumption. Or that God is somehow more present at the big church.
Yes.
Or we can access God better there. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Which kind of means that children can't access God.
Right.
Yeah. So I want to talk about St. Gregory's.
Yes, please.
Wendy and I have both learned a ton from St. Gregory of Nyssa Church in California, in San Francisco. Founders are Donald Schell and Rick Fabian, and Paul Fromberg and Sarah Miles are carrying the work forward, have both carried the work forward. But it's really been a laboratory for the Episcopal Church, I think, and we've both just drawn from that well so deeply, to the point that almost everything that comes out of my mouth, I'm like, and that was Donald. Learned that from him. So I'm curious what you feel like the big lessons of St. Gregory's and their work has been for you in your work with intergenerational communities.
Well, I had the gift of meeting Donald at a NACID conference back in the day, before we even were Forma, and was just immediately struck by his imagination and generosity, and so he became someone that I wanted to be in relationship with and learn more from, and he's just such a wonderful mentor. And it really wasn't until I was reading Rick's new book, Signs of Life, yes, which is a challenging read, but really worthwhile, that I realized that there's also this deep theological underpinning that I had just absorbed, and that is the continuing arrival of Jesus into the world all the time, everywhere, which, of course, had been part of my childhood too, but I was learning to articulate it in new and very helpful ways. And that, this second coming that we think we're waiting for sometime over here is actually happening in our midst. Mm-hmm. And that overlap that you always have talked about so movingly to me of heaven and earth, happens right in our own tables and in our midst. Yeah. And that's just been such a gift to me, such a gift to me.
It's a sacramental theology that's very alive and vibrant and feels like you can kind of touch it and hold it. It doesn't so much point upward as it's like, at St. Gregory's, they're always like, God is here right now. Present in the bread and the wine, like among us. So I think that sense of immediacy.
And changing us right now to do God's work in the world, And that's what I feel compelled to share with children, that this doesn't wait until they grow up. This is something that they are a part of right now, every day, at recess, and on the playground, and in their homes, and making a difference in the wider world. That is something that we all are called to be. I believe that's why we were created, is to help do this work, to help bring heaven to earth, even if it's just for moments at a time.
And I think for me, St. Gregory's, there's so much that was learned, and a lot of it around formulating worship around the newcomer, which has just been huge. But another piece that I've learned from Donald in particular is what it means to work with congregations from a place of bold invitation rather than kind of fearful, a place of fear, I guess. And he talks a lot about when you invite people to do something that's a little bit scary, the language of if you feel comfortable is actually a disinvitation. That what we're asking people to do in church is and should be somewhat terrifying. Like Aidan Kavanaugh talks about, like, this is a moment of like God's chaotic like entry into the world. Like, it's scary, right? What we're coming to face each Sunday. And it's a time, we hope, of transformation. And I think as leaders, we can get to a place where we feel really shy about that, like what we're inviting people into. But St. Gregory's has people dance, like everyone dancing in a circle at every Eucharist. And there's people who, there's 20 people there who have never been there before, and everybody's doing it in their own way, like whatever their bodily ability is. And the invitation is a bold one. And I think if you make that invitation cautiously, people will opt out immediately. So the idea of saying, this is a little bit scary, and like I'm gonna meet you in that and invite you in, as opposed to like, saying like, well, if you feel comfortable, you could try it. It's like, that's not an invitation. Invite people toward their fear, not away from it. And if it's not something they're able to do, they can opt out. So the timidity, I think, like losing the timidity has been huge. And also, we both talked about the fact that Donald just says yes all the time. To congregants, to folks who want to start new ministries, there's a lot of invitation.
He's a permission giver, and I have had some wonderful permission givers in my life in the church, which just makes all the difference. And he has high standards. We talked about that too. I mean, he does want things to be beautiful and reverent, and he's also fine with the chaos.
Yeah, saying yes to someone can be an invitation to collaborate and learn, not an invitation to do whatever you want in a way that's disconnected from the mission of your church, right? Or an invitation to chaos. So
Absolutely.
Finding that kind of place of collaboration and connection within permission giving and really inviting people into their gifts.
So there's another fabulous gift from Donald and Rick that we use all the time at Trinity in so many contexts. We've worked it into meetings and to our pilgrimages. So it's the practice. Well, of course, in worship, it's the practice of what did you notice? And I wonder if you'd talk a little bit more about that, because that was something we did every week after the Eucharist at St.Lydia's. After the meal ended, after everything had been cleaned up and put away, a group of congregants and visitors and whoever wanted to take part in the conversation would be invited to come to the table. And that was the question posed to them. What did you notice?
It's such a beautiful question. And it's like a gift that keeps unfolding, that question, because I think it invites people to a place of observation as opposed to judgment. And it's so easy to go immediately to a place like, well, I didn't like that hymn, or like, I really love it when, the kids sing in worship, which is not a particularly generative conversation to talk about what we like, and it's also rooted in ourselves as opposed to the community. So the what did you notice question, I think, really invites people and asks them to be attendant to how God is showing up right now, which is such an amazing practice to give to people. And to say, I noticed that the kids were hesitant to come up around the table when we invited them up. I wonder if the table is like really high up and removed, and that's a little intimidating to them. What would happen if we brought it down lower toward the pews? It's such an invitation, and it opens everything up to wondering, which is a great godly play question, as opposed to this place of judgment. And I think it makes our processes around worship this just world of possibility, as opposed to kind of a world of like limited choices, if that makes sense. It's also a contemplative practice. So even at the end of your day, to say, what did I notice today? Or like, that conversation was hard. Like, what did I notice about my reaction? Just a very contemplative manner. And I found that the whole congregation being rooted in that question brought us to a completely different place in our identity as a people. We were asking different kinds of questions. And asking it corporately and publicly was really a fabulous practice. I have a question for you. So you talked a minute ago about sort of the message for kids of God is here right now. And I thought, like, well, that's a great message for adults too.
Yes.
Everyone needs to hear that.
Yes.
And I think so much of what you've talked about, you've said adults are hungry for as well. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, we assume we assume so much of what we do, particularly around the liturgical year and the faith at home practices are meant for families. We've started speaking more intentionally about households because everyone, I got that from Lene Peterson, everyone can find themselves in a household, even if they're a household of one. And it doesn't rely on the idea of having a partner or having children present. And really, so much of what we've offered in terms of what people can take, the connections that they can physically take away from what we're offering them are things that adults are drawn to too. I have this fabulous, we're not going to show photos because we didn't get that organized, but I have this fabulous picture of Winnie Varghese doing a blessing of the backpacks. And of course, the photographer focused on the children, but what the photographer couldn't capture were the rings of adults who've brought their briefcases and their satchels and are longing for a pocket cross, which of course we gave them, to put inside, to be a part of that blessing. I have brought here a little prayer bowl that we made. One of the great gifts of my work at Trinity has been able to be at the retreat center with Daniel Simons, who formerly was at St. Gregory of Nyssa before he came to Trinity, and so that just strengthened my bond. But, we got these just for $1 or $2, these little dishes, and decorated them with metallic Sharpies, and people could collect and place objects in them for prayer. Mm-hmm. So, an acorn for growth, for marking growth or praying for growth, a piece of a rainbow ribbon for promises made and promises kept. When my son Peter was, when was your sabbatical, Emily? What year was your sabbatical?
I think he was like 12.
Yeah, I think so, 12, 13. He preached at St.Lydia's while Emily was on sabbatical, and he was pretty sure that, a lightning bolt would come and smite him, that he was committing some grave heresy by preaching, just, by a child preaching. But he preached on the call of Samuel, and that night, we lifted up the rainbow ribbon for, the promise that he kept. And Roger Hutchison told me that we needed a Lego brick in our prayer bowl for creativity. And of course, we have these angel tokens, these pewter angel tokens that were given away to the firefighters and recovery workers. That's all they wanted. Even when the piles were still so hot, the soles of the men's boots were melting continually. We'd go out to the pile with bottles of water and eye drops and granola bars. All they wanted were the angel tokens. So, these objects that we think we're providing because they're helpful for children are every bit as helpful for adults and wanted and needed. And I think it helps us to really be mindful that so much of what we do really can be for everyone.
We love categories, right? But when you start to bust them open, really exciting things start to happen. And in what you're talking about, I hear this real hunger and desire for a faith that you can hold, that's tangible, something you can hold on to, whether that's a warm loaf of bread or a little something you can have in your pocket. And I think it speaks to the shift from a sort of mentality around Christian education to formation, because we often think of Christian education as stuff that goes in our brain, right? Like learning about faith means taking in information and reading books and learning things. Whereas I think Christian education formation is about experiences. It's about touching and holding God. It's about drawing near and then saying, what just happened? That mystagogy question, what just happened? Which is basically, what did you notice, right? Right. So can our formation and our education revolve around experiences that are shared, and then noticing and wondering and
the relationships
together
that are built.
Yes.
So, I arrived at St. Lydia as a single parent and had been since Peter was 14 months old. And one of the things that happened really beautifully was that at least 2 adults from St. Lydia's became special guests in Peter's elementary school classroom when he had to bring a special, it was Grandparents' Day or the day to bring a dad, and of course Peter didn't have one, and that was just amazing. But these intergenerational relationships are so important, and we have to provide real opportunities for them to flourish. And they're not only to benefit the children, they benefit the adults every bit as much. It may take them longer to realize it, but I think that's just been such a huge thing. When Emily and I were texting to set this up, she realized that she had an old phone number of mine, and she realized that because her last message to me was about taking Peter out for ice cream. And he's turning 17. It's not that he doesn't still like ice cream. It's just that he can walk to Ample Hills by himself now. So these relationships are so powerful and so transformative in faith communities. Sunday school is dying. It was never meant for the purpose of faith formation. I think this is a gift to us, an opportunity to really find deep new ways and old ways, based on my own personal experience growing up in the church, of giving people experiences and helping them make relationships and meeting God, changing the world, helping to bring about heaven and earth that way.
How's our time?
So I think it's time to ask people, have people ask us questions. Yeah,
Okay,
here. So I've got there's another microphone.
Fabulous.
So this is what we'll do. Hi.
Hi, my name is.
Do we turn it on?
Is it on?
No.
No, it is not.
Flip the little button up on the bottom.
There it is, maybe. There we go. Okay. My name is Retta Wiley. I'm in Baltimore. I want to
come visit me.
connect with you. But I live in Baltimore, but my church is up in Towson, and it is my church is 160 years old, and the architecture always wins.
Yep.
And so I do not want to abandon what I think is a very beautiful and rich historical reality of my church, but I don't know how to do all of these amazing, innovative things in such a static space.
Yeah.
What do we do when we don't have an enormous
Flexibility.
endowment?
Oh,
And
the
we don't
915
have-
actually didn't cost any money.
Well, this is the thing. I mean,
But yes,
it
we just have
either
flexible
takes
space.
it
It's
either
true.
takes a ton of resources or zero resources.
Yes,
Right?
yes,
Those are the
that's a good
things.
point.
And so I feel in some ways I feel encumbered
Yeah.
by the resources that I have to do innovative things. And I would love to know what you have heard from the community of the disciples of St. Gregory of Nyssa about how to make some of these things a reality when we are carrying these beautiful old buildings that are very static.
Great question. And I spent some time several years ago. Donald Shell did a lot of work going to work with congregations around architecture specifically, and I think it's easy to look at a place like St. Gregory's or St. Lydia's and think, oh, you have these open buildings. You can change the seating. You have a rotunda. All these beautiful things architecturally that are different than what many of us have. But it was really interesting to work with him around more traditionally formulated spaces and ways that you can. It's hard, right? But there's ways that you can work, I think. And it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. But I know one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen done is when you're teaching paperless music to have everyone turn toward the center aisle and face each other. And suddenly you're a church in the round and people can see each other. And even just, one or two songs facing each other completely changes the experience of the congregation. And I often ask people to just, at the beginning of worship or sometimes as part of an invocation, I invite people just to look around the room and just make eye contact with people, and it totally shifts the whole dynamic. I think there's also ways we can use our narthexes and our chancels in creative ways, which can sometimes feel a little scary. But kids can come up in there. You can take out a few pews in the back and create a gathering space, and maybe even have a gathering at the back before processing in. There's things you can do, but it's definitely, it can be tough.
All Saints Pasadena removed the bottom of their rood screen, and it looks like lace. because the top of it is still there, and they used the bottom, all the material from the bottom, for like forming the base of a baptismal font and other pieces of furniture, the pieces of furniture that hold the flowers on Sundays. At Church of the Epiphany, where I was for almost 14 years, there's an altar rail and a high altar, which the priest can stand behind, but it prevents the children from coming to stand around it. But they can come right up to the altar rail. And I happened to be there one Sunday with a little boy who had just been baptized, and he was new to our church. He had come to be baptized with a family member who lived nearby. And so I sat with him at the altar rail, and I whispered to him everything that was happening. And when Andrew Mullins lifted up the host, he whispered to me, "Is that the bread everyone eats? Does it taste good?" And of course, I didn't want to lie. I said, "Actually, it doesn't taste all that good, but it's really special bread. That bread is Jesus for us. And when we eat that bread, Jesus is in us, inside us." And he whispered fiercely, so fiercely that Andrew could hear him. He was just a few feet away. "I want that bread." But he wasn't back in the pew where it would have been so small. He was right there. And so, there are ways, even if you can't do the things that you think you might. It absolutely helps to bring a lot of people into the conversation before you change something up, and get some buy-in and get people to brainstorm with you. Because other people have ideas that won't have occurred to you, in part because you've been seeing the space for so long. And sometimes, fresh eyes help, or just a different mindset, and getting people of different ages to imagine with you, I think, is also a really helpful idea.
It helps to go in and think, where do I want to go? What feels cozy? What feels cold? Just kind of approach the space new and say, are there nooks where I want to go and read a book? What's my visceral reaction to the space? I also think a rug can change everything. Putting a rug in a chancel makes it a totally different, softer space where people feel much more invited. So there's some ways to work.
Other questions? Wow.
All the way in the back.
So someone back here, and then you.
Hi, could I ask a question about dinner church?
For sure.
Please.
So I'm in a small congregation, and we have a part-time clergy person who doesn't live in town. And so I'm senior warden, and we do a lot of things with the lay people.
Yeah.
Is there everything I've read about dinner church involves a priest and Eucharist.
Yeah.
But without a priest present, potentially, is there a model for dinner church that works?
Absolutely. I think there absolutely is. Early on, when St.Lydia's was in formation, I had an Episcopal bishop who asked me, "Is this an agape meal or is it the Eucharist?" And I said, "It's both." We at St.Lydia's found it very important to have an ordained presider, because we were very clear that this was Eucharist. It was not like a pretend Eucharist. It was real. God was in the bread. And so before I was ordained, because I was not yet a pastor when St. Lydia's was in formation, we had guest presiders every week. However, that was our context. And I think that there's so many ways of doing dinner church where it is an agape feast or an agape meal, or you could call it a sacred meal, and you can bless the bread and bless the cup and use language that's expansive in terms of what theologically is taking place. I mean, every meal we gather around is a sacred meal. So I think it's up to your community to formulate what you think is happening in that moment and what you're drawing around together. So yeah, I would say there's a ton of freedom for lay people to lead and to do that work of making a meal sacred together. You're really pointing, right? You're pointing to what's already sacred, if that makes sense.
Every table is an altar. Every
Yeah.
meal is holy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the practice of telling stories around started at the campfire, and then at the dinner table, and only later in the temple and in the church. So those are the things that are really essential. And if you're having Eucharist at another time, go for it.
Absolutely.
This is more of a comment, and in 1985 there was a film that came out called The Witness. Cops and robbers hiding out in the Amish. There was an Amish barn raising scene that people were fascinated by. I was a pastor then, and they kept saying, we loved that scene. Well, everybody had a job in making the barn.
Yes.
And the meal, which was essential, because you try to work all day without eating. And even though it was a little sexist, and the boys and men made the barn, and the women and the girls did the meal, even the smallest children handed up nails or put spoons on the table. Everyone had a job. Everyone was fed.
Yes.
And people were so attracted to that. I mean, we were given this gift of what is needed decades ago.
Yeah.
And now we're struggling to figure it out.
Well, and I think smaller churches have an advantage here. They do this because they have to, and they think that it's a loss, but it's not. It's a strength. It's a gift, and we just need to be better at letting people know. Thank you for walking. Of course. Hi.
Actually, my question's for you. So here,
Okay.
it's weird to use a mic to talk to you, but
It's being recorded, so it helps.
So I am rector of a pretty big church, which is a blessing, and we're adding essentially a 9:15. Ours is going to be a 9 family service. And the thing that really caught my attention is you're saying Sunday school is dying, because ours is dying, and the people who are consumed by what will happen when we change our Sunday schedule, which we are changing our Sunday schedule, the biggest thing I'm hearing is, you're going to kill the Sunday school. And I actually think we might. So my question is, first of all, just a real factual, do y'all still try to have Sunday school after the 9:15?
So we've done something really intentional and really different since, particularly 20 months ago, Trinity Church closed for renovation. So for the first time in the history of the 9:15 service, the 11:15 congregation at Trinity Church, the ones who think that the 9:15 isn't real church, came to St. Paul's Chapel for church, and they overlapped during the 10 o'clock hour. So we decided that we would have something that we call whole community learning. And once a month, it is all ages together. And actually, in January and February, and hopefully not in March, hopefully our new building is going to open in March to the public, every time that we gather, we are everyone together. So the first Sunday of the new year was also our rector's last Sunday. Beautifully, it coincided with a gift I found in a book by Sharon Ely Pearson, who's sitting right there, who's got, what is the name of your series, Sharon? Faithful Celebrations, and ideas for intergenerational gatherings for the entire church year and summer and the saints. The idea was a Japanese practice of first writings, and we had a calligrapher come, and we had materials for people to write a quote, and our rector's wife happened to be Japanese, and she thought we'd done this especially for her. It was really beautiful. But the next Sunday was the Feast of the Baptism of Christ, and 60 people stayed for Godly Play Large. We had our dove kite, we had the Paschal candle, we had the actual font, and we walked through the story of the Holy Baptism from the Godly Play script, but used the actual holy objects, referred to them. And when it came time for each person to receive their light, they each came forward and named themselves, received a candle, planted it in the table we use at Compline, the sand table, and the light grew and grew. And a third of the people were adults, at least, who came forward. In fact, people who were visiting St. Paul's for the first time, who happened to just stay and see what was taking place. So each week now, for the next couple of months, everything we do, we're doing together. So we've got lots of resources up on our website to share that particular model. We'll take it into the new building. We have 45 minutes of education, basically, so that people are really only committing an hour and a half. So that partly helps. So we're continuing to have Godly Play, which is a big part of why people look for us on Sunday mornings. They know that Trinity has this long history with Godly Play. And we also do have adults who are very committed to their own education, but very intentionally, at least once a month, we blow that up and put everyone together, just to build community, just to see help them understand how they're learning from each other. So we have lots of good resources to share.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you so much for coming. It was so fun to be here with you. And now we're going to have Eucharist, I guess, across the street.
Thanks, everybody. Not right here, across the way. Although that would have been a good way to go out, right? Hey, thank you.
Thank you. It really was. Oh, yeah. Take a postcard of Emily's book.